Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of From the Lighthouse. My name's Stephanie, and I'm here today with an author who I'm actually reading a lot of at the moment, and I'm very excited to speak to. So I'm here with Harry Turtledove, who is an American author best known for his work in the genre of alternate history, although it should be noted that he does work across genres. Publishers Weekly actually described Harry as the master of alternate history, and as somebody who's currently doing work on alternate history, I'm extremely excited to talk to Harry. So, Harry, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So, Harry, I guess my first question is an obvious one, but it's an interesting one for my purposes and also for listener purposes. Why alternate history? What drew you to this genre initially, and why do you keep returning to it?
Well, let's see. I always read science fiction, and always means from about the time when I was 8 years old when I discovered it.
Mm-hmm.
And science fiction warped my entire life because when I was 14 or 15, I found a copy of L. Sprague de Camp's Lest Darkness Fall in a secondhand bookstore and paid, I think, 13 cents for it. And I was an astronomer by original intention. I got into the California Institute of Technology. I flunked out of the California Institute of Technology at the end of my freshman year because calculus was much tougher than I was. And I ended up with a PhD, God help me, in the history of the Byzantine Empire, thanks to having read Lest Darkness Fall at an impressionable age. And I started trying to find out how much de Camp was making up and how much was real, and I got hooked. And this is alternate history on the micro historical level, if you like. I mean, this is the alternate history of my life, which would have been entirely different if I hadn't found that book for another couple of years. Without that book, I wouldn't have written most of what I've written because I would have written something. I already had the bug. I wouldn't be married to the lady that I'm married to because I met her when I was teaching at UCLA when the fellow under whom I had studied had a guest appointment in Greece. I wouldn't have the children I have. I wouldn't be living where I'm living now. Other than that, it didn't change my life a bit. And, when you're someone who wants to write science fiction, and you're trained as a historian, what are you going to do? You're probably going to, or at least I did, was use the technique of extrapolation that ordinary kinds of science fiction use, which is to say, change something in the present or the closer future, and then see what the more distant future looks like. Except with me, it was change something in the past and then see what the nearer past or the present looks like and extrapolate that way. And that's what I've been doing for now the past 40 odd years. It's working.
Yeah, it seems to be. I think that your answer really points to the way that we use counterfactual thinking all the time. We're constantly thinking like that. What if I hadn't gone there that day? What if I hadn't met this person at this particular moment in time? What if I hadn't?
Exactly.
It's a function of human thought, really.
This is why alternate history came into being long before other kinds of science fiction did, because other kinds of science fiction, like historical fiction, depended on the rapid change introduced by the Industrial Revolution to make people notice that things were changing all the time instead of being more or less constant from one lifetime to another and changing much more slowly over a couple of centuries.
Mm.
But alternate history, everybody has these thoughts. What if I started dating Fred instead of Ralph? What if I hadn't had that accident on the way to my job interview? And that's why Livy, who may have had an accident on the way to his job interviews around the time of Christ, wondered what would have happened if Alexander hadn't died in Babylon in 323 BC, but had turned west and attacked Rome. And Livy, being a nice patriotic Roman, thought that the Romans of the early Republic would have kicked Alexander's behind. Personally, I think Livy was an optimist, but that's neither here nor there.
So many alternate histories turn on particular figures in history like that. What if Alexander the Great hadn't died? Or, Stephen King in his 11/22/63 posits, what if we could save President Kennedy?
Mm-hmm.
It strikes me, though, that a lot of your alternate histories don't do that, that they're more about kind of societal forces, I guess, or about, for example, in Wages of Sin, you think about like, what if AIDS had developed,
Yeah.
Centuries before it did in reality. I was wondering if you could speak to that, the sort of the great man, I guess, mode of history that alternate history sometimes traffics in versus the kind of thing that you do, which strikes me as a little bit different.
You need both. There are great people. The world would look an awful lot different if Philip of Macedon hadn't been assassinated in 336 BC. But you need the wider picture of what's going on too. And I mean, this is probably what comes of having trained as a historian all these years ago, that I try to stir the pot, as with strokes as broad as I can make them.
Yeah, and I mean that's interesting because a lot of historians are actually quite hostile to alternate history or counterfactuals, and you've got examples of historians saying it's a parlor game, it's a trick, it detracts from actual historical analysis. But then you do have historians, and you are trained as a historian, who think about it in terms of testing causality. If we play with different causes not happening, maybe we can come up with something else, or we can identify which cause is sort of most constitutive. So how do you think about like the function, I guess, of the alternate history or the counterfactual beyond, I guess, kind of creating interesting stories?
No, I don't basically.
Fair
um,
enough.
if I don't create an interesting story, I don't eat. That's
Yes, that is true. Yes.
But the other thing that I'm going to say is that all fiction, and not just science fiction, not just alternate history, not just fantasy, all fiction is about the world that the writer is living in. It's not about the world the writer creates. And one of the things that alternate history lets you do is that it gives you a funhouse mirror in which to examine the world that you are living in, that you can't get any other way. And that's the attraction of it for me as a historian, as a historian and as a writer.
And you certainly see that, I think, in the preponderance of alternative histories or counterfactuals about alternative Second World Wars, basically, where, what if Hitler won? Which is probably the most popular, certainly the most kind of paradigmatic alternate history. Like, that's what we think about when we think about alternate history.
The other one here in the States is, what if the Confederate States had won the Civil War?
Of course, yeah. And that's Bring the Jubilee, isn't it?
It goes back, basically it goes back farther than that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
yeah. When you're writing an alternate history, how do you come to imagine these sort of, often people talk about these nexus points, at what point did history change in an alternate history from the historical record that we know to the alternate history? How do you sort of come up with your ideas? Like what do you think about in terms of like where to pivot?
All right, I'll talk about that with what is probably my best known book, which is The Guns of the South.
Yes.
Which is the one that shows Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, on the cover of the book, and he's holding an AK-47. This was my idea, by the way. I hope people walking by the bookstore shelves would look at that and do a double take and think, why in hell is Robert E. Lee holding an AK-47 and want to buy the book? But the way I got the idea And it's the book that let me quit my day job. So I'm extremely glad that I did. The way I got the idea was I am friends and have been for close to 40 years now with the fine fantasy and sometimes alternate history writer Judith Tarr. And Judy and I, in the late 80s, wrote back and forth. This was before either one of us had email. So we'd write back and forth all the time. And one of the times she wrote me, she was doing what writers often do. She was pissing and moaning about the cover art for a book that she had coming out. And she snarled, "It's as anachronistic as Robert E. Lee with an Uzi, for Christ's sake." And I looked at that and I thought, I can do something with that. And I wrote back to her and I printed out my letter on the computer. And I added a hand scrawl PS at the bottom of the letter. Who'd want to give Robert E. Lee an Uzi? Time traveling South Africans, maybe? If I write it, I'll give you an acknowledgement. And I looked at that and I thought, I can really do something with that. And before I put the letter in the envelope, I Xeroxed it to make sure I didn't lose that hand scrawled PS. Because one of the things that you always hate to do is have an idea and then forget it.
Yes.
And so I made sure I kept it and I wrote it. And I was in the middle of writing a couple of fantasy books, so I knew I wasn't going to start right away. So I had more than a year to do some research, and I did my research and I started writing. And people seem to have liked the results. So, I mean, this is, as I say, this is the book that gave me the courage to quit my day job. I had at the time 3 small children, so it wasn't something I did casually.
And I mean, I think that's kind of the fun of counterfactuals and alternate history, is that idea of just doing something completely wild, like giving Lee an AK-47, doing that sort of really unexpected, making an unexpected move in historical fiction. Because as somebody, I specialize in historical fiction, so I read a lot of it, and a lot of it is, to me, quite repetitive and quite predictable. Mm-hmm. So what I love about alternate histories is that shock, that surprise. What if there was an alien invasion in the middle of the Second World War, to use another example from your book?
Well, that one, the story I'll tell about that one is that I am still annoyed at Larry Niven and Jerry Purnell because
okay, sure.
because I was doing I got the idea for that book back in the 1970s, and I thought this would be cool to do. And the problem was twofold, really. One, that it, especially back then, less so now, was that it was within living memory, but not within mine, which is a dangerous kind of period to write about. And 2, that I didn't think I was a big enough writer to try it. So I did a lot of homework on that and kept doing this, kept doing that. And one of the ideas I had, being the kind of person I am, was that when aliens invade, what are you going to do? Who are you going to call on to help you try and solve this problem? And the answer I came up with was science fiction writers. Who else? They're used to dealing with aliens. But the problem was that Larry and Jerry published Footfall several years before I published the first World War book, and they had the same idea and used it before I could, and I gave them grief about it for years.
So basically, if aliens do invade tomorrow, we should be calling you?
You should probably be calling somebody better trained in science than I am, but I'll pitch in.
That's good. That's comforting. You talked a little bit about research and doing extensive research. And I guess the thing that's complicated about alternate histories is that you have to do research in order to ground this in something. But at the same time, these are histories that didn't happen. So how do you approach that conundrum? A lot of the listeners to this show are writers themselves. We use this as a teaching aid for our creative writing
I'll
students.
help you if you're talking to me.
But I was wondering if you could just talk about your research process. Like how do you get started, and how much is too much, and when does the research kind of almost get in the way, I guess?
You'd better not let the research get in the way. There is a writer's syndrome called "I've done my homework and you're going to suffer for it,"
Mm-hmm.
and you want to avoid that at all costs. I think of it as an iceberg. 90% of it is underwater. You know this stuff. And with what you say, the things you specifically say, you suggest that, well, of course, you know all that other stuff that's down there under the water, holding the world together so that it doesn't fall apart when you're not looking right at it. The person who was really a master at doing this, although with him it was a fantasy world rather than a world of alternate history, was Tolkien.
Mm.
Because you knew without the tiniest doubt that whatever you asked him about his created world, he could tell you right off the bat, even if he wasn't telling you all about it in the text. That's the impression you want to try to create, or that's the impression I want to try to create anyway.
I guess that's also the real joy of doing this, because you have written about pretty much every historical period that I can think of over your career. So you must have amassed an absolute treasure trove of research in that time.
I've done a fair bit, yeah. That's true.
From the American Civil War to Nazi Germany to the Byzantine Empire to, everything, the 19th century to everything in between. I was wondering if there was any periods or alternate history scenarios that you haven't been kind of willing to touch, or if there's a sort of any kind of limits in your mind about what you're willing to do and not.
It's not willing, it's able. There's a difference, because all right, I have never, and I don't imagine myself ever writing alternate history about the Napoleonic period. I don't know enough, and there is an awful lot to know, and I don't know it, and I'm probably never, I'm 75 years old now. I'm never going to acquire that knowledge, and I'm just, at this stage of my life, I'm not going to worry about it.
But you are still extraordinarily prolific. You've got a new novel, Twice as Dead, coming out in March this year. I was wondering if you could talk about that novel, because it strikes me that novel is very interesting in its combination of a few genres: alternate history, fantasy, noir.
It is not alternate history. It is fantasy. It is urban fantasy set in Los Angeles right after the Second World War. And I get to play with, and as you say, there is a lot of noir in it. I'm not, I did that on purpose. I get to play with things like race relations, like corrupt cops, but I also get to play with things like zombies and vampires and, and ghosts. And when you stir them all together, you get what I hope is an enjoyable mishmash.
Well, yeah, and I mean, but you say that it's not alternate history, but to me it kind of is, because it's imagining, a specific historic point. Yes, it's not a historic point that matches with the historical record, but it's still recognizably post-war.
It's recognizably late 1940s Los Angeles, but it's fantasy. I mean, magic works.
Exactly. But
you
again,
cannot produce that by you cannot produce that by alternate history. Alternate history doesn't, or at least in my view, alternate history does not let you change the laws of the universe and whether there is a God or not, and what he or they do inside the world. That's not alternate history. That's fantasy.
Do you think, is there any kind of I guess added kind of attraction in doing this kind of fantasy take on the past versus alternate history, which, as you say, sort of have to follow the kind of rules of reality? Did you find this more freeing, or did you find it a more difficult process? I was wondering
It's
if you could talk to this
it's
new
just
novel.
it's fun. I have fun writing. I mean, but I have fun writing. That's what I do. It's what I've done my whole adult life. God help me. The line I use is that I secrete words the way a slug secretes slime. They come
um,
out.
it strikes me that a lot of alternate histories imagine history going wrong. Like histories, a lot of alternate histories are written about, what if Hitler won the Second World War? What if the South won the American Civil War? What if, to use that Napoleon example, I know you haven't written on that, but what if Napoleon won at Waterloo, for example?
Oh yeah, that
Um,
that those were some of the very early modern examples because French, almost as soon as Napoleon lost, the French started writing about what if he had won.
well, yeah, yeah. So why do you think we're drawn to these kind of more negative or more kind of nightmarish scenarios versus, the kind of what if history got better? Like, what if we could change bad things? And,
It would be boring.
yeah.
And I'm not kidding. I'm a writer. You do the bad stuff because it's interesting. It's exciting. It has people getting tormented, people getting killed. That's what people falling in love, people falling forcefully out of love. I mean, about the most stressful situations you can put people in are situations either where they're either falling in or out of love or where they're at severe risk of being killed. And that's what we write about. It's what we've been writing about as long as we've been writing. And
So you
probably
think, there's no sort of, there's no tension, there's no like, there's no
no,
problem.
everybody's happy. Okay,
Yeah.
fine. So what? I mean,
Can you,
Huxley did that with Brave New World, and
yeah, yeah. Well, exactly. I guess like the ways in which that kind of manifests in alternative histories are the time travel alternative histories where you get people trying to go back and fix the past and they inevitably fail.
or sometimes succeed, and then it's not what they want.
Well, exactly. And again, I'm thinking of the Stephen King novel where they try to, the protagonist tries to save Kennedy, saves Kennedy, but then ends up in a worse situation.
I have a story coming out, short story coming out in Asimov Science Fiction this year about swarms of people trying to change what happened in Sarajevo in 1914. So yeah,
Yeah. Well, there's another one that's sort of similar to that by Ben Elton. I'm not sure if you know of it. Time and time again, where he has his protagonist travel back in time to try and prevent the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And again, it goes wrong. But that's the fun of alternate history. You get to play with those moments.
sure. I mean, well, that's the fun of writing. You're God.
Yeah,
You know,
and you have the whole historical record to
well,
play with, I guess. To go and
as much of it as has survived, as much of it as I can read, there are all the qualifications you need to put.
yes, absolutely.
As much of it as I believe, what I believe about it, it's as I say, you're not writing about the created world. You're writing about the world you're living in, and with that comes recognizing your own limitations, or it should.
Mm. Um, to pick up on that point, which is quite right, and something that I'm always telling my students that all fiction is about the world in which you're situated, the writer's situated. Um, do you think that our particularly parlous times at the moment are going to lead to this like resurgence of interest in alternative histories? Because I am noticing that alternative histories are becoming more popular, are becoming more ubiquitous, are being adapted into television. Thinking Man in the High Castle, the Plot Against America, etc., etc. Do you think that this is a particularly important moment, or will be an important moment for thinking about history, through the alternative history?
I think I really have no good answer for that. I think that anyone who thinks that history teaches anyone lessons for longer than about a lifetime is an enormous optimist. We, you know, history doesn't always repeat itself. Sometimes it just screams, "Why don't you ever listen to me?" and throws something at you. Which I think was first said by John W. Campbell, who is not in good odor these days. I mean, and there are many good and cogent reasons why he isn't too, but he was a hell of an editor and he was not a stupid man. Very strange man, but not a stupid man.
I think we've had good examples in recent years, haven't we, of history repeating itself in various ways.
Well, it tends to do that. I mean,
I'm just wondering about, climate change. It seems to me that an alternative history would be an interesting means of thinking about climate change and like going back and trying to stop it before it can, becomes a runaway problem, especially in the landscape of what's happening at the moment with the fires in LA.
Yeah, well, that's less. I know a couple of people who've lost their houses. I live in Los Angeles, and that's a perennial worry here. I have seen fires come over the mountains. I mean, down. I know you have the same problem in Australia, where every so often big parts of your cities burn because you've moved you've built far enough out that you're out in the countryside. And yes, it's lovely, it's peaceful, it's calm. Then it burns.
Yeah. Yeah, it just seems to me to be an interesting kind of thought experiment. For those people who perhaps not readers of alternate history or haven't yet dabbled in alternate history, I was wondering if you could recommend some of your own work as well as some of perhaps the landmarks of alternate history by other writers to give people a kind of sense of what the genre can do. Because I think it's a genre where if you're in the tent, as you and I are in the tent, you get it. But I think perhaps other people may not be so familiar.
Okay. All right. I'll start with myself because I'm vain. Also,
well, and you should.
and also because I have a better chance of remembering my own titles. um, the two of mine you can start with if you're interested in this kind of thing. I mentioned Guns of the South, which is about the South winning the Civil War with the aid of time traveling South Africans who feed them lots of AK-47s, and then starting to wonder, why are they doing this? Now that we have our freedom, what do we do with it? It's sort of like the dog who caught the car after he chased it. Okay, here we are. Now what? And the other one is that came out in 2022 is much shorter and also stands alone, and it's called 3 Miles Down. 3 Miles Down is set in the 1970s, which for my sins, I am old enough to remember pretty well. And it's based on a true incident. In 1968, a Russian submarine carrying nuclear missiles sank in the Pacific north of Hawaii. And the CIA spent a moon landing's worth of money, and I mean that literally, hundreds of millions of dollars, to build a ship that could raise the wreck of the Soviet sub from the bottom of the sea. This is all real. This happened, except that they only raised the front part of it and didn't get as much information as they wanted. They got some of the codes, but they didn't get to look at the missiles or anything. Okay, that really happened. Where I turned it into alternate history was, all right, they discovered because we had better technology than the Russians did. We found the sub on the bottom where the Russians couldn't. We had a submarine trailing cameras on long cables that took pictures down there. Except in my alternate history, some of the pictures show the alien spacecraft that sank the sub. And we go from there. My protagonist is a graduate student, not in history, but he looks a bit like me. as I look then, he isn't bald yet. And he's on the Hughes Globar Explorer, and all right, what do we do with the aliens? How do we deal with them? He's, he's smarter than I am. He's already started publishing SF, which I hadn't yet. I'd tried, but I hadn't succeeded. Uh, so yeah, I have fun.
Um, uh, you can I name a few that I would recommend by you? Through Darkest Europe.
I'm sorry.
Strikes Through Darkest Europe strikes me as a really interesting example of your alternate history. So that posits that the First World basically is the Islamic nations. They are the sort of big world power rather than the Western world.
Oh yes.
Which I think is such an interesting thought experiment. A few alternate history writers do that sort of kind of flipped world power experiment. So something like Through Darkest Europe. I'm thinking of Kim Stanley Robinson's The Years of Rice and Salt.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh yes.
And Bernardine Evaristo's I've had a mental blank on the name of her novel, which is terrible. I'm looking around my office because I actually teach it. Blonde Roots does a kind of similar thing where instead of white people enslaving black people have enslaved white people. So I thought that was a particularly interesting thought experiment. I was wondering if you could talk to that novel.
Oh gosh, give me the title again. I'm
Through Darkest Europe from 2018.
Oh yes. Oh well. This is another one that I get to blame on Sprague de Camp.
Yes, yes.
Because Sprague pointed out that in the real world, the Muslim thinker Al-Ghazali and Thomas Aquinas in the Western world both thought about and wrote about the relationship between science and religion. And Al-Ghazali said that science was corrupting to religion, and I think he was undoubtedly right. Because if you have answers that you can actually test, then you don't need the answers that are in the Holy Book. But Thomas Aquinas said, no, finding out more about how nature works is part of finding out how God works. And, Aquinas's view became normative in Western Europe, and Ghazali's view became normative in the Muslim world. And I wondered, well, what would have happened and what would the world look like if those positions had flipped?
Mm.
If Islam had embraced science and technology and run with it, and Western Europe had gone in the other direction. And I thought, well, okay, that's interesting enough to write about it. And I found an editor rash enough to pay me money for it. So
But as you say, it draws attention to kind of, when you're talking about like our own world is what these books are all about. It draws attention to the stupidity, I guess, of presenting the Western world as a kind of inevitability. Of course, the West was going to rise.
I'm very, as you would guess, I'm very bad on inevitability, just generally speaking. Things aren't inevitable; they're contingent.
No. Yes.
And that's part of what makes them interesting.
And that's what makes alternative history so interesting, because it does demonstrate that, but for this, but for that, but for this tiny little thing, but for, somebody took up this idea. History and our lives, the worlds we live in could be totally different.
Given that we are less than a week away from the second term of Donald Trump, may I mention another book of mine?
Of course, please do.
I wrote the short story that it was based on just after the turn of the century, so no one can accuse me of being intentionally political or talking about anybody in particular with this. But the story is called, and the novel is called Joe Steele. And it's set in a world where these A husband and his pregnant wife came to the United States in the 19th century, a few months before their son, Joseph Zugashvili, was born. And in 1932, Joseph Zugashvili, who had changed his name to something more Americanly pronounceable, like Joe Steele, which sounds a lot like the fellow who ran Russia for so long, becomes president of the United States and spends the next 20 odd years dismantling the Constitution. Now, what Trump's first term taught me was that I was much too optimistic about the strength of institutions when they're attacked by somebody who wants to attack them,
Mm,
because things yield more readily than I thought they would. But
mm.
that's what I was writing about. I was writing about a totalitarian United States with with J. Edgar Hoover in the role of Beria, and and all the merry henchmen.
I'm very interested in that, but I'm also sad that you were so prescient.
I when I used to be on Twitter before I got the hell out of there, I had a pinned tweet that said, "I didn't mean to be topical. I didn't mean to be topical. I didn't mean to be topical. I didn't mean to be topical." I say that a lot.
Yeah, sadly, I'm reading. I just finished doing some work on the Hitler wins scenario books, and as I was reading them, I thought I got to stop because this is just hitting a bit too close.
Mhm.
So
Oh yeah,
alternate history can be incredibly topical.
yeah, but I wish that some of the stuff that I'd written what weren't so topical.
Yeah, I wish it had remained in the realm of fantasy.
I mean, I did another South Wins the Civil War, and it was a South Wins the Civil War that, you know, with the aid of England and France. And when World War One rolls around, it rolls around on both sides of the Atlantic, and the United States, allied with the Kaiser's Germany, beats the Entente powers, which include the Confederacy. And then the Confederacy goes fascist and things really go south, so to speak.
It
Yeah.
sounds to me like alternate history is what people should be reading right now, to be honest. I think we've just about run out of time, but thank you so much, Harry. It has been such a pleasure to talk
Oh,
to you. And
thank
such a pleasure to talk to somebody whose works I am really quite literally immersed in at the moment. So thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm sure our students and our listeners will find this really fascinating.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.